9 years in, when they told me raises were frozen company-wide, I believed it. Renata said it herself. Everyone was in the same boat. I didn't even feel entitled to be upset about it. Then a page that wasn't mine sat on the shared printer. A new hire's offer letter. And before I finished reading the number, something in my chest already knew this wasn't a coincidence. $22,000. More than me, for less than my job. If you've ever done the math on what your loyalty was actually worth to a company, you already know the feeling that hit me standing at that printer. So I asked for one document, the current salary band for my role. I wanted to see, in writing, whether the freeze they told me about had ever really existed or whether it was only ever meant for people like me. I put the page back face down, the way I'd found it, and walked back to my desk like nothing had happened. 9 years of reading rooms had taught me that. You don't react to what you've just seen until you know what it means. I coordinate regional distribution accounts, vendor contracts, shipping schedules, the kind of work nobody notices until it breaks. I'd built that function from a spreadsheet 3 people shared into something the company actually depended on. The year before, I'd caught a freight contract renewal that would have quietly cost us 6 figures over its term, buried in a rate schedule nobody else had read closely enough to question. Renata had stood in front of the regional team and called it the kind of catch that justified my whole role. I remembered that when she told me about the freeze because it meant something to me that the praise had been specific, not just kind. My review that spring said exceeds expectations in writing the same week Renata told me comp was frozen. I didn't connect those two facts yet. I just filed the disappointment where I filed every other one. Someplace I didn't look at too closely, next to the raises I hadn't gotten in years 3, 5, and 7, each one explained by a different version of the same sentence. Everyone's in the same boat. I promise you that, she'd said, sliding the memo across her desk like she was doing me a kindness by explaining it herself instead of letting HR send an email. The memo said the freeze applied across all bands, company-wide for the fiscal year. No exceptions listed. I read it twice and believed it because I had no reason not to, and because believing it cost me less than resenting a place I'd given 9 years of my life. 3 weeks later, I was asked to train a new analyst. Younger, sharp, hired in one level below my role, doing work close enough to mine that I'd be teaching him half of what I did. That part didn't bother me. Companies hire people. I remember being the new one once. He was easy to like, which made everything after this harder to hold on to cleanly. He asked good questions. He stayed late the first week without being told to, trying to get the vendor codes right. I found myself hoping he'd stick around. The way you hope for anyone you've decided is worth the effort of teaching properly. None of what came next was his doing, and I want to say that plainly before I say anything else about him. What bothered me came the following week at the printer down the hall from my desk in a stack of pages that weren't mine. His offer letter, base salary listed in plain type. I wasn't looking for it. I was there to grab a shipping manifest. But my eyes caught the number before I could stop them, and I stood there doing math I didn't want to be doing. $22,000 more than me, for a role a full level below mine. I put the page back exactly where I found it and walked away before anyone saw me standing there too long. I told myself there had to be an explanation, a different budget line, some market rate adjustment for new hires that had nothing to do with the freeze. I wanted that explanation to be true more than I wanted to know the actual answer. Keep that number in mind. It matters later. For 2 days, I did nothing but turn over. I didn't want to be the person who made an issue out of another employee's paycheck. I also didn't want to be the person who found out later that I'd known and said nothing. So I did what 9 years in this building had taught me to do when something didn't add up. I went looking for the document that would tell me the truth instead of the feeling. I asked a friend in finance, casually, over coffee, whether new hire compensation was exempt from this year's freeze. She thought about it for a second longer than I expected. Not that I've ever seen written down, she said. But I don't touch comp policy directly. I just process what compensation sends me. I asked if that meant there could be an exemption she just hadn't seen. She shrugged. There could be anything I haven't seen. That's kind of the point of asking the right department instead of me. She wasn't trying to be unhelpful. She was telling me, without meaning to, that the real answer lives somewhere I hadn't looked yet. If it's exempt, it should say so somewhere, she added. Nothing in comp policy is ever really unwritten. That sentence became the thread I pulled. That night, I reread the freeze memo Renata had given me, line by line, the way you reread a contract after something goes wrong. Across all bands, company-wide, for the fiscal year. No carve-out. No exemption clause. No mention of new hires at all. If the freeze really covered everyone, the letter I'd seen on that printer shouldn't have existed. So I filed a formal request through HR's compensation transparency process, the same channel any employee can use to request their own role's current salary band. It felt strange writing my own name into a process I'd never had a reason to use before. I told myself it was just information. I didn't fully believe that yet. I waited 5 business days for that band to come back, and I noticed how strange those 5 days felt. I kept catching myself hoping I was wrong, hoping the band would confirm the freeze exactly as Renata had described it, so I could put the whole question down and go back to not thinking about it. Part of me understood, even then, that once I had the document in hand, I wouldn't be able to choose not to know what it said. The band came back on a Thursday afternoon, and I read it twice before I let myself react. The range for my role had been raised this cycle. Not by a large amount, but raised company-wide this fiscal year, the same year I've been told there was no room to move at all. I checked the effective date twice, thinking I'd misread it, thinking maybe the increase applied starting next fiscal year, and I was looking at a forward projection instead of the current reality. It wasn't a projection. It was already in effect. It had been in effect for 2 full pay cycles by the time Renata sat across from me and told me nothing could move. The freeze wasn't a freeze. It was a decision about who the increase got applied to. And I hadn't made that list. I thought about all the ways I defended this place to other people over the years. Friends who complained about their own jobs, people who asked why I stayed as long as I had. I always had an answer ready. Stability. Fair treatment. A company that took care of people who took care of it. I sat at my desk with that band open on my screen and realized I'd been defending a version of this place that had stopped being true at some point I couldn't even pin down. I sat with that document a long time before I did anything with it. There's a specific kind of quiet that happens when a feeling you've been talking yourself out of turns out to have been correct the whole time. It isn't satisfying. It's just heavy. A few days after that, the same friend in finance forwarded me something she probably wasn't supposed to send, an internal email thread she'd been copied on by accident. I almost told her not to send it. I read it anyway. It named a process I'd never heard of, a compression exception, a formal, documented allowance that let new hire offers clear above what current employees in the same band were making when needed to stay competitive against outside offers. Case by case. Requires manager sign-off. Renata's name was on the approval line. Dated the same week, she told me there was no room to move. I read that line 4 times. The manager who told me there was no budget had personally signed off on finding budget for someone who hadn't worked here a single day. That was the moment the story stopped being about a number and started being about a choice. I want to be fair to what I knew at that point, because I think fairness is the only thing that made what came next mean anything. I didn't yet know why Renata approved it. I didn't know if she'd been told to, pressured into it, or if she'd made the call herself without thinking twice. I only knew what the document said, and what it said was enough to ask her directly. I asked to talk to her the following morning in her office, door open. I wasn't looking for a confrontation. I was looking for an explanation that made the 2 documents fit together honestly. I put both in front of her, the freeze memo and, without naming how I'd seen it, the compression exception. I asked her plainly, If the freeze applied to everyone, how does this exist? She didn't deny it. She also didn't explain it. That's a different budget category, she said. I don't set the bands. That comes from compensation. Both technically true. Neither one answered the question I'd actually asked. But you approved it, I said. Your name's on the exception. She paused there, longer than the rest of the conversation had taken up to that point. Compression exceptions go through a lot of hands, she said. I'm one signature in a longer chain. I asked whose idea it had been to apply it to this particular hire. She said she couldn't discuss another employee's compensation details with me, which was true, and which was also the first time in the conversation she'd used the word true as a wall instead of an answer. I asked again, more specifically, not about the process, about her signature. She said she'd have to look into the specifics and get back to me. She followed up that afternoon by email, restating almost exactly what she'd said in person, in writing this time, closing with a line about how much she valued my patience while compensation reviews the full picture. I read that email 3 times too. It wasn't a lie. It was a person choosing not to say the true thing out loud, dressed carefully enough that it would hold up if anyone else ever read it. That told me something the documents alone hadn't. This wasn't a mistake she didn't understand. It was a decision she understood well enough to avoid explaining. I'll come back to that email. It matters more later than it seemed to that afternoon. For the next week, I went back to doing my job, training a new hire who had no idea any of this was happening around him, running vendor calls, closing out a shipment delay that had nothing to do with any of it. Work doesn't stop because your trust has cracked. I've learned that's actually one of the harder parts. The ordinary tasks keep needing you exactly when you have the least capacity to give them. Renata was different with me that week. Not cold, exactly. Careful. She copied a second manager on emails she used to send me directly. She scheduled our one-on-one for a conference room instead of her office, with the door shut instead of open. I noticed all of it, the way you notice a person recalculating how much of themselves to show you. I didn't say anything about it. I didn't need to. The distance itself was information. But I didn't stop pulling the thread. I used the same compensation transparency process again, this time requesting the budget planning sheet tied to that quarter's comp decisions, a document I was entitled to see once I could show it referenced my own position. It took longer than the first request. When it came back, I understood why Renata hadn't wanted to explain anything out loud. There was a line next to my name, dated weeks before my review even happened. Retention risk, low. Next to the new hire's line, a different note. Flight risk, high. Competitive offer required. I sat with that longer than I sat with any of it. 9 years, and the reason I didn't get a raise wasn't that there was no money. It was that somebody had already decided I wasn't going anywhere, so there was no reason to spend anything keeping me. My loyalty hadn't been valued. It had been priced as a discount applied automatically before I'd even walked into my review. I want to be honest about what that did to me, because I don't think it's useful to pretend it didn't land hard. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was something closer to grief. For 9 years of assuming that doing good work and staying loyal counted for something measurable, and finding out it had instead made me cheaper to keep. I thought about my son asking me, the year before, why I never looked for another job when I complained about work at dinner. I told him something about stability matching more than a bigger number somewhere else. I remember feeling proud of that answer at the time. Sitting with the retention risk note in front of me, I understood that the company had read my own stability the same way I described it to him. Not as loyalty worth rewarding, but as a variable it no longer had to account for. Remember that note? Retention risk, low. It was about to stop being just mine. That night, I laid the documents out on my kitchen table in the order I'd found them. The freeze memo, the offer letter, the salary band, the compression exception email, the retention risk note. 5 pieces of paper that, on their own, could each be explained away as a coincidence, a misunderstanding, an unrelated budget quirk. Together, they only told one story. The company had raised pay for the people it was afraid of losing and frozen it for the people it assumed would stay quiet. I hadn't been forgotten. I'd been calculated. I sat with that sentence a long time before I let myself act on it. Once you can say a thing that plainly you can't really go back to not knowing it. The question after that wasn't whether this had happened to me. It was whether it was only happening to me. I went back through the compensation transparency channel one more time, this time asking a broader question, not about my own band, but requesting a comp equity review for employees at my level across the department, citing my own findings as the basis. I expected to be told that wasn't something I could ask for. I was surprised when the request was accepted and routed to HR compensation. Weeks later, a draft equity analysis came back to me as part of that review, further than I expected it to go. It showed several other employees at my tier, people I knew by name, sitting 15 to 20% under the current market band for their roles. Nearly every one of them carried the same kind of note in the file behind it. Retention risk, low. This had never been about one manager being unfair to me specifically. It was a pattern applied across a whole tier of people who had stayed long enough to be considered safe to underpay. That's the sentence I kept coming back to. Not "this happened to me." This is how they decide who's worth paying more. The formal review that followed wasn't dramatic. It happened in a conference room with Priya Kell, the VP who actually controlled the budget authority behind all of this, and Dana Whitfield from HR compensation, who'd been the one to approve routing my equity request in the first place. Priya opened by framing the gap the way I expected her to, as a standard market adjustment for new hires necessary to stay competitive in hiring. "We can't lose good candidates to a rigid pay structure," she said. "That's just the market we're in." That explanation might have held on its own for one offer letter. It didn't hold once I laid out the freeze memo next to it. I asked her directly why the market we're in only ever seemed to apply to people who hadn't started yet. She didn't have an answer ready for that. And for the first time in the meeting, she looked at Dana instead of me. It collapsed completely once the retention risk note and the tier-wide equity analysis were on the table beside it. Priya tried once more, something about the notes being internal shorthand, not a formal policy, but shorthand repeated across a dozen files in the same language is its own kind of policy, whether anyone wrote it down as one or not. I said that out loud, as calmly as I could manage, and let the document sit there instead of arguing further. Dana was the one who said eventually that the compression exception process had never been intended to create sustained internal gaps of this size. That was meant for occasional, individual cases, not a standing practice across a whole pay tier. She didn't perform outrage. She just said it plainly, the way you'd read a policy back to someone who'd stretched it past what it was written to do. Priya didn't argue with her. That, more than anything said directly to me, told me which way this was going to go. Dana opened a formal band correction review that afternoon. I didn't get an apology in that room, and I want to be honest that I'd stopped expecting one. What I got was something more useful, an acknowledgement on paper that the pattern was real. The review took another 6 weeks to close out. My band was corrected, with back pay calculated against the internal audit's own findings, not a settlement. Correction tied directly to the documents I'd surfaced. The other employees named in the equity analysis received corrections too, on their own timelines, based on their own numbers. I never heard whether they knew my request was what started the review, and I decided that wasn't something I needed credit for. The correction matching was enough. The company also adopted a new policy. Any compression exception that would create a gap above a set threshold now requires HR compensation sign-off before it can be approved, not just a single manager's signature. That threshold exists now because of 5 pieces of paper I found in the order I found them, on a printer in a salary band in an email I wasn't meant to read, in a note with my name on it, in a pattern that turned out not to be mine alone. Renata and I had one more real conversation weeks after the review closed. She told me, without me asking, that she'd flagged the growing gap internally months before I ever saw that offer letter, and had been told to hold the line, that headcount budget was tight and new hire competitiveness came first. I don't think that excuses the choice she made to deflect me instead of telling me the truth in her office that morning. I do think it explains it. She was protecting her own position the same way the whole system had been built to protect itself, at my expense by default. Understanding that didn't erase the year I lost. It let me stop needing to hate her for it. I still do the job I've always done. I still train the people who come in under me, including the one whose offer letter started this. He doesn't know any of it happened, and I've decided he doesn't need to. None of this was his fault. He was hired into a structure that already existed before he sent in his resume. What changed isn't dramatic to describe. My number is different now. The policy is different now. Somewhere in a file, there's a written record that this pattern existed and that it was corrected, not excused. I don't tell this story at work anymore. Not really. A couple of people who went through the same equity review know pieces of it, and we nod at each other sometimes in a way that doesn't need explaining. Mostly, though, it lives where I keep it now, not as a grievance I bring up, but as a fact I know about the place I still choose to show up to every day. That distinction matters more to me than it used to. Knowing exactly what a place is capable of and choosing to stay anyway is a different thing than staying because you never thought to ask. I still have that first offer letter in my mind more clearly than I have almost anything else from that year. Not the number on it anymore, but the exact moment my hand was already putting it back face down before I'd finished admitting to myself what I'd read. That's the image that stays with me. Not the confrontation, not the correction. Just a hand moving faster than the rest of me could keep up with, already protecting itself before I understood what it was protecting me from. If a company has ever told you there's no room to move while quietly finding room for someone else, you already know that feeling doesn't need explaining. I'd ask you this in the comments. When you've caught a number like that, did you go looking for the paperwork or did you let it go? I think that decision says more about us than the number ever does. If stories like this resonate with you, subscribe to Copper Note.